So my task is really to talk a little bit about comprehensive immigration reform and where we are now. I'm going to go over this very quickly. I've got 10 minutes, and maybe just before I finish, I'm going to cover, in the most cursory way, a conversation about unattended immigrant children, because we've seen that hitting Virginia more recently. We've seen it in the news. And what I'm going to do is sort of cover the highlights, and then in the 10 minutes after this, where we get to talk together about it, that'll be your chance to really say, okay, well, here's the politics behind that, or here's what else is going on as I see it, and that'll be your portion of the conversation. So if that makes sense, here's what we're going to start talking about first. I thought path to citizenship as a concept would be a useful way to sort of highlight the different components of the bills that are out there or what we've seen recently. So that'll be the first piece, and then as I said, we'll talk about the other pending legislation. So this is the first sort of graphic. This illustrates S744 in very rough terms, sort of suggests that the start of any comprehensive immigration reform, if it were to follow the track of Senate Bill 744, would begin with these border triggers. These would include things like building a wall by some people's account, or employment verification, or exit system triggers that would be in place before we could begin to offer the other components of the legislation. The first stage for anyone who was entering this process would be the RPI status. Then they would be offered the opportunity to renew this registered provisional immigrant status. This is a new concept that came to us as a consequence of some of this legislation. And so it is, I think, a helpful thing to get your mind around. This is not a lawful permanent resident status. It is a provisional status granted for 6 years, renewable for 6 more years, and somewhere along that 10-year mark, which you see here illustrated by a star, is the first opportunity to apply and to begin sort of filing your paperwork for what might in the future be permanent residency status. So that's the path to citizenship that we've heard talked a lot about, as it's illustrated in Senate Bill 744. There are lots of other pieces to that, but we'll get to those in just a moment. Let me go through the next piece. Wrong way. This is what it might look like for dreamers, right? So the kinds of discussions have often been distinct, whether you're talking about someone who's previously undocumented, an adult living in the United States for some period of time, applying through that process that was imagined in 744. This is what it might look like under the Dreamer legislation. So again, certain border triggers, a 5-year provisional status, and then the opportunity to become a lawful permanent resident, with the end game being citizenship at some point in the future. And then this is what it might look like for agricultural workers. 5 years, blue card status, quirky new concept, an opportunity at the end of that 5-year period to begin applying for lawful permanent residency, and then in the end game being citizenship. So lots of different tools have been suggested about how we might get there. Senate Bill 744 is the first of those. That passed the Senate in 2013. On the House side, we saw House Resolution number 15 introduced October 2nd of 2013. That hasn't gone anywhere. Several bills that have moved in the House were moved through the Judiciary Committee. And so you'll see those. House 2278, the SAFE Act. Folks generally know what I mean when I say the SAFE Act. This would empower local law enforcement to enforce federal law with regard to immigration policy. That is really problematic in many respects. House 2131, the Skills Visa Act, to allow persons in the United States, foreign citizens entering to go to school here, to apply for visas to stay and work in the U.S. An Ag Guest Worker Bill, 1773, and a Legal Workforce Act. Let me remember what that one is. That's the E-Verify. Remind you what that one is. That's the E-Verify program. It's a system to confirm the lawful presence of a person prior to their employment. So that's that piece. And then things like H.R. 1417, border security results. That went through a separate committee process, not judiciary. It went through the Homeland Security Committee. And then other legislation, the American Families United Act, the CIR ASAP Act, I think that sounds great. The Enlist Act, intending to encourage persons who are undocumented to go into the military, and as a consequence to benefit from their service and giving them the opportunity to seek citizenship that way. These are all rather complicated, piecemeal, some of them very punitive in their consequences, reactions from the House of Representatives to what has been on the Senate side a proposal for comprehensive immigration reform. Just any quick questions about what I've said here? There's a lot there, but I'm trying to squeeze it all in 10 minutes.
This legislation is passed? Or
So each one, so these are not passed. The others indicate whether they've passed through the committee process. The only one that's passed through the entire body was the Senate side, right? So, so these are all pending. The other issue I wanted to highlight for our conversation is about unattended minors. We've read or seen this on television. In my own life, I used to live in Brownsville, Texas, so I've made a couple of calls to family and friends who have done some of this work, and they've been telling me some of the first-hand accounts of the challenges faced by unattended minors in South Texas. They are seeing it in really dramatic ways with large numbers, tens of thousands in this case. I think from January to June, 52,000 unattended minors entering the United States, the majority of them coming from Guatemala, from Honduras, and Salvador. This last week, I think we've seen in recent weeks real struggles from the federal government trying to decide what to do about not only providing care for these young people, but then also making certain that they have legal representation. There are several issues I'm going to raise here in just a moment, but I think it's important to note that this is something that the federal government doesn't quite know how to handle. I was on a call last week with FEMA folks. This is the Federal Emergency Management, what is the last one? Agency. They were brought in because it's being treated as an emergency, because the on-the-ground housing of these young people is being seen as an emergency that FEMA has the capacity to serve. And so bringing in the short-term emergency providers on the ground has been their part of the response. The other group that I was really surprised to hear on the call was the Department of Defense. And so increasingly they are utilizing military encampments to provide facilities for caring for these young people. So they are being housed on military bases, 3 of them so far, and others that are on the list as potential places to house them. So let me just cover what I think are some of the concerns. Unattended children are given the benefit of the doubt until their status can be determined, and they are cared for in that meantime by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So when they come into the U.S. without an adult who can speak for their status, if they are undocumented, they're first sort of treated in this early stage in the first couple of days to identify, what their status is. Are they coming from a country or a circumstance that could be where they could be treated as a refugee? Or instead, are they coming from a country or a circumstance that is clearly just an undocumented person that needs to be repatriated? So they determine that in a very early stage. That's sort of the first piece of it. In all cases, they are cared for by the Office of Refugee Resettlement until we determine that. Secondly, 85% of children under ORR care are released to family and friends while awaiting immigration proceedings. So I think they'd estimated when they were trying to place a group of kids in Lawrenceville, Virginia, they'd estimated that the maximum time they would be there would be about 35 days. And that would only be because they are relocating young people who could not be placed with a family or close family friend. Here's the dilemma. The policy that has been now in place for all of, I think, 9 years gives these 3 different components to how we treat children. If a child has a reasonable fear of persecution or torture in their home country, they can be granted asylum. On the Mexican side of the border, people are now saying, hey, this is a way to get your kid into the U.S. They have to go in unattended, they have to go in and declare their eligibility for asylum, they have to identify some proof that they have a fear of persecution. If a child fled abandonment, neglect, or abuse in their home country, they can get special immigrant juvenile status, another category that's being articulated as a way to enter the United States. If a child is a victim of human trafficking, then they're eligible for a T visa. These are difficult things to prove, they require proof, and frankly, it's challenging for any unattended minor to do this without legal representation. And so one of the dilemmas I think that we face is what we're going to do about making sure that young people have that representation. I've raised these three questions for us to think about what are the root causes that are making parents want to risk the lives of their children, crossing several borders in some cases, risking the travel that is dangerous to get here. What can we do to make sure that children have the proper care when they do arrive in the United States? I think the challenge for FEMA and the challenge locally was really dramatic. And then finally, what legal support will unattended minors need to be properly represented in their immigration cases? There are more questions. Why don't I leave that to our discussion?